everyone. My name is Joel Faflak, and I'm the director of the School for Advanced Studies in Arts and Humanities at Western University, formerly the University of Western Ontario, where I'm also a professor in the Department of English. This event is overseen and sponsored by the International Festival of Authors, and we're very happy for their sponsorship here today. It's part of the 36th edition of the International Festival of Authors. The IFOA Ontario, the festival's touring program, is now in its 9th year and partners with libraries, bookstores, universities, and communities to some of the most exciting writers of contemporary literature across the province, including our guest today, Russell Smith. The IFOA Ontario continues to support PEN Canada in its work to free writers who have been silenced. Usually an empty chair appears on every stage at the IFOA to represent all authors who are unable to attend events such as this. Among these is secular writer, blogger, and activist Avijit Roy, who was killed by members of a militant Islamic group affiliated with Al-Qaeda. Avijit wrote and edited 10 books on science, rationalism, atheism, and literature during his lifetime, and was killed for his writings at the age of 42. This year, 4 secular bloggers have been killed in Bangladesh, most recently Niladri Chatterjee, who was murdered on August 7th. If you'd like to support PEN's advocacy for secular writers and bloggers in Bangladesh, please sign the petition by signing the PEN Canada petition outside the doors here after this event. You give PEN Canada a stronger voice to lobby against such injustices. This event is presented to you in partnership with London Public Library, WordsFest London, IFOA Lit on Tour, and IFOA Ontario. This year, IFOA Ontario travels to 17 different locations: Brantford, Burlington, Etobicoke, Hamilton, London, Markham, Midland, Orillia, Owen Sound, Parry Sound, Penetanguishene, Scarborough, St. Catharines, Thunder Bay, Windsor, Woodstock, and London, of course. I'd also like to take this time to draw your attention to the Ron Benner exhibit entitled Indigestion, currently on display at Museum London. Benner's installation began with a series of simple questions about the food we consume, who grow it, where it is grown, how it is processed and shipped. In answering this question, Ron recounts the journey of 2 boxes of bell peppers sold at London, Ontario's Covent Garden Market, tracing the origin of the peppers to their source. I encourage all of you to browse this exhibit after this event. And now to the event itself. I first became familiar with Russell Smith's work when an undergraduate student at Wilfrid Laurier University, where I started, told me about a collection, Young Men, 1999. Your 3rd collection, I think. Is that right, Russell?
3rd book.
3rd book, yes. Super. And after I read it, I thought to myself, I wondered why he told me to read this, and I actually followed up with him. We're actually 1 degree of separation because one of the people who hired me at Wilfrid Laurier University was Russell's father, Roland Smith, who was a formidable presence, and I mean that in the best sense of the word, formidable. People feared him, but they feared him because he spoke his mind and you knew exactly where he stood with him. And I think fearlessness is a huge part of Russell's writing. Today, we're going to ask Russell to speak or read from his most recent collection, of course, Confidence, and after which I'll interview him for roughly 30 minutes, and then we'll turn things over to all of you to ask him questions. Russell is one of Canada's funniest and nastiest writers. That's what they put in the script for me to say, but I love the word nasty. After reading Confidence, I'm thinking, yeah, I like nasty. His previous novels include How Insensitive and Girl Crazy. They're records of urban frenzy and exciting underworlds. He writes a provocative weekly column on the arts in the Globe and Mail and teaches in the MFA program at the University of Guelph. Russell presents his latest collection of short stories, Confidence, which shows a darker side of urban dwellers, including mommy bloggers, I love this, experimental filmmakers, and PhD students, who are among the darkest, of course, you'll know. The only darker people are the faculty members who supervise them, of course. I'm going to turn things over to Russell now because you really want to hear from him. He's going to read from Confidence, and then he and I will sit down and have a chat. Thank you, Russell.
Is this my yes. Thanks very much for having me here. I am going to read the opening of the last story in the collection, and the story is called Sleeping with an Elf. Their favorite restaurant they called the Elf. Not because that was its name. Its name was something as trying too hard as harvester or barber shop or bicycle shed. Actually, bicycle shed was what they called it too sometimes, because there were bicycles and tractor parts hanging on the walls. Or sometimes they just called it Beards, as when they asked each other, do you want to see Beards tonight? Its real name was not well known because, of course, it was not displayed anywhere. To have a sign on the window in that neighborhood at that time was to admit an unseemly ambition. You might as well have put up a sign saying Franchise Inc. Actually, they agreed that would be an extremely clever name. They called it the Elf because there was an elf who worked there. He really did look exactly like an elf. In a Christmas drawing, he was just over 5 feet tall. It looked like, even if in his lace-up boots, and extremely skinny and pointy and tiny in all regards, and he wore a tall wool toque in all weather, and even in the heat of the open kitchen as he darted in and out from behind the counter, carrying tall beers made from local hops and spring water, with labels printed on threshing machines, and house-smoked pork bellies and taro chips and bacon-salted Brussels sprouts, his stringy little arms all knotted up and his tiny tattoos writhing. His nose was hooked, and even his ears seemed a little too large and upright for his body, holding up the enormous black wool cap like trestles. The elf never spoke to Dominic and Christine or to anybody. He was an angry elf. And that seemed natural, part of the decor, too, like the host with the mustache waxed into curlicues and the meticulously banal folk music on the sound system. So, Christine said, where would you meet yours? Online? Dominic did not answer, partly because he did not want to. Of course, he'd go online like everybody else, but he was not ready to talk about his part in the dangerous game. He was only ready to hear Christine's. And partly because he was trying to swivel his body around a few degrees so he could get at least a glimpse of the tables to his right, where he thought he had seen Concetta Accoglienza, sitting with a tightly clad young woman, possibly her daughter. This operation made him wince because of his stupid fucking hip and knee and whatever the fuck was fritzing out or rotting or disappearing in his nerves. His cane was gone, taken away with his coat and hooked onto a rack near the entrance. He was going to try to do without the cane if he had to make it past the kitchen to the washroom, which was good. He could be stronger. He could try to do without it more, and Christine hated seeing him with it. Don't look at her, said Christine. Don't you want to play the game? At who? He said almost automatically, and then, yeah, sure, I love the game, which was true. And it was what they were there for, to play the dangerous game. It was exciting in a place like this, flashing with bodies and strangers, exactly what the dangerous game was all about. Wait a second, he says, the idea is we're going to talk about who we're going to sleep with, and I can't turn around and look at a girl? She said, it's Concetta whatever's daughter. It must be. They look identical. You can't stare at girls no matter what I'm talking about because it's rude no matter what. What's her name? La Chupacabra? What? It's a crazy name. What about her? Concetta. She's nice. She likes you. You like the older ladies. He said, can't stare at girls when you're talking, can't do this, can't do that, but I should do this. She said, oh, lighten up. I'm just suggesting. He said, I should have sex with Concetta Accoglienza. See, it's not hard to pronounce. You want me to? Christine shrugged. I'm just suggesting. I'd be okay with it. What's the matter? You look like you're taking a big shit. I'm hurting, he said. Sorry, not supposed to talk about that. He was hurting, but he was also eager to turn the conversation away from sleeping with Concetta Accoglienza because, of course, he had already slept with her more than once, but not for a long time. Years ago, in those days when he and Christine were hurting each other so ferociously, and before Concetta had come into the money and started the art foundation and married the developer and gone directly out of Dominic's league. It was still not something that Christine needed to know. She said, you want to go home? He said, of course not. This is trying, like I promised. This is me trying. She said, try to have fun. He said, I could have more fun if you'd let me at least look to see who's here. I want to see the costumes. Feeling the sparks up his spine, he pulled his hips around and sat facing the room and the front door. Everyone was pointy and small in there, including Dominic and Christine. Dominic was feeling particularly small since he'd hurt his hip or had had whatever mysterious thing had happened, his nerves mysteriously dying for no reason any of the endless tests could discern. He was still bigger than the elf. "Oh," said Dominic, "look, this guy's too good. Look, a farmer. You see the farmer by the window?" He looked, and Christine looked at a bearded guy who couldn't have been older than 23, sitting with his legs stretched out into the waiter's path, a guy with a heavy wool sweater and tweed trousers and a tweed cap and knee-length Wellington boots. Christine said, "He has to sit that way so everyone can see the boots. Without the boots, it's just casual wear. Look at the girl." The girl with him was not from an Irish bog in a fashion spread about tweed. She was from a city, but from another city, a city in the 1940s. She had the pencil skirt and the glossy black bangs and the blouse with the puffy sleeves and the line up the back of her stockings and the chunky shoes. Her lips were the sharpest outline of red in the room, except perhaps for Conchetta Acolienza's. "It's good," said Dominic. "It's a Rosie the Riveter thing." Christine said, "It's a pin-up thing. She has tattoos, anchors, and that." Dominic said, "She does burlesque. God help us, when will it die?" "God save us from burlesque," said Christine, "and the lectures of fat girls." "It's hilarious," said Dominic. "I wouldn't be surprised if the next guy that came in was a pirate, then Louis XIV. What are you going to be?" She said, "Sad clown." He said, "Sexy cop, robot, bumblebee." Through the garage door, the big garage door front window, they could see women who were dressed as prostitutes, because they were. It was Friday night. The prostitutes, sadly, would all be gone soon if there were more places like the Elf, which would be very good for Dominic's property value, but much less good for his sense of romance, of being alive. Strange how prostitute was never a costume you'd see in here in the Elf. Across the street was the white fluorescence of Djibouti Cafe and Restaurant Business Club. Thank God, still there. It was never romantic in there or just outside it. "Hey, there's Frederick at the bar." Dominic waved at the hunched figure in his black hoodie, but Frederick didn't turn around. He was writing something on index cards spread in front of him. His video camera was on the bar, pointed at him, its red light on. "Poor old Frederick," said Christine. "You wouldn't do him, would you?" I think no friends it has to be, none of my guy friends." She said, "Of course not, none of my girlfriends either." He said, "So where would you get your guys? I mean, who do you want to do? I am fascinated by this. I want to know everything. I want to know what it is you want to happen. You want romance, you want a nice date, and a guy who pays attention to you, or you want..." "Jesus Christ, no," said Christine. "I want a 21-year-old or a 19-year-old. I don't even care if he talks." He said, "Jesus." She said, "Is that sick?" He said, No, it's not sick. It's a little frustrating." She said, "Frustrating?" He said, "Well, it's just sad. I want to do you all the time, like every day and every night, like a 19-year-old, and you don't seem to want that." She said, That's not fair. That's not..." Christine sighed and was unable to come up with anything else, or so it seemed to Dominic, who was vindicated. "I get it." He said, "I get it. It's not natural to stay with one partner for so many years. Believe me, I get it. I can't believe we're finally admitting this." He caught the glance of the elf who was rushing by, and the elf actually bared his upper teeth as if snarling. "I would want to know every detail of it, though, everything, including technical specs like hydraulics, displacement." She said, "You are threatened by the 19-year-old. I don't know if I could do it anyway." He said, "Even I wouldn't do a 19-year-old. She said, "Okay, so tell me who you would do. You'd go to your exes first, I guess?" "I guess." Dominic slumped a bit, eased the tension on his right buttock, and then left the pain shift from his outer to his inner thigh. His exes were all almost as old as he was now. Conchetta Acolienza was much older, although she looked like perfume itself over there, in her black lace dress and her jingling bangles and necklaces. She was showing a lot of faintly lined breast. He said, "But I want to know about the 19-year-old. Would you just approach one on the bus?" She said, "I don't know when I'd take a bus." He said, "Well, see, you'd have to." She said, "I'd ask Helia for one of hers." "Helia? What do you mean, one of hers?" She said, "Oh, since the divorce, she's been on a tear. I don't know where she meets them, online probably. It's all very casual, just hookups." No way. How? Where? Dominic was picturing Helia, her vast breasts and her maternal way with him as if he were Christine's little brother. Helia! Are women like this now? How did I miss this? He supposed Christine herself was once like this, at the time when he had met her. So it's Helia who's inspired you, right? I get it. You've been hearing her stories. You're envious of her freedom. Christine shrugged. I guess, yes? Yeah, well, me too. She sighed. She said, we need our drinks now. He said more gently, it's the meeting and the dating that I'm scared of. It just exhausts me, the idea, all the spending and the waiting and then the tearful phone calls. And then meeting for coffee to apologize and be friends. Oh, God, yes, said Christine. I have no interest in dates. And that's probably the scariest thing about it. I'm not afraid someone would get weird in bed or pull a knife on me. I just don't want him to send me a fucking poem the next day. Dominic tried to remember if he had sent Christine any poems early on. Of course he had. Look, she said, the whole thing is embarrassing. I know. I can't stand to hear people talking about dating. You know what they mean by dating? People say they're dating when what they mean is they took each other's clothes off. And there's something always a little embarrassing about that. And they saw the other person's squidgy genitals and breasts and hairs, and then they touched mucous membranes. And they were excited and disgusted by this and wondered if they had to do it. When you say dating, you make a picture of restaurants and glasses of wine. Dating is actually tasting someone's genitals and trying to make them come. We should call it something more accurate. Wow, said Dominic. The cocktails were finally there. Dominic grabbed his, a murky amber tumbler with some kind of brown berry floating in froth at the top. It was sweet and bitter, like all of them. The little waiter tried to remind them of what they had ordered. So this is your smoke drop with the lingonberry and the white. Thank you, we're fine. The waiter turned quickly. I agree with all this, said Dominic. It's a very strange thing. We should call it something more honest. It's not dating. Dating isn't what it's about. We should call it something that represents the most medical of nakedness, the exposing of the most private processes, like witnessing diarrhea. We should call it shedding. We should call it molting. Yes, said Christine, I am molting with him, you would say. And people would look away like you'd said I had a colonoscopy. Dominic laughed in the flash of pride he often had when Christine was on a roll. He wished his friends were around to see it. Even Frederick should come over and be reminded. He said, should we ask Frederick over for a drink? And then, do you want to do Frederick? Oh, it would be too sad to do Frederick, she said. Oh, he's not sad. Look, he's fine. Look at him, he's working. She said, what does he work on? What does he work on all the time? What does he live on? This was a question she'd been asking Dominic for years, and he still didn't know, so there was no point in answering, which was fine because another tiny waiter was on them, calling them guys, and telling them about braised cabbage and pork brine and Northern Ontario pickerel, and then informing them, once they had made their basically random choices, Dominic and Christine didn't care about food all that much, that it was all good. So, said Christine, it's all good. Or is it? You don't really want to do it, do you? I thought you were so frustrated. You said yourself, predictable. Our sex life has become so predictable. He said, yes, I do want to. I said so years ago, and you freaked out. No, don't say you didn't, because I recall it exactly. So yes, I want to try it. I'm amazed that you want to. I'm just trying to process it. I would have been terrified to even suggest it to you, and I was always getting in trouble for staying out too late and having coffee with exes. She said there was a lot of coffee with exes, a lot. Here's Frederick. Frederick sat heavily on the banquette beside Christine. He did not look at them because he was looking down into the upturned screen of his video camera as he always did. Frederick had not shaved in a few days and had had a cigarette very recently. His glasses were so thick one could never really see his eyes except as giant projected eyes on small convex screens like the mouths of fish in a bowl. Tell me, said Frederick, what you are thinking right now. The camera was pointed at Dominic. Said Dominic, I am wondering about something to do with my wife. Dominic turned away and wrenched his hips again so that he could stare at Conchetta Acolience's daughter as he spoke about this. He said, my wife has suggested to me that we have an open relationship. Frederick did not look up from his screen. He never did. This was his trick. Conchetta Acolienza's daughter. Dominic had met her once and should remember her name, Nicola, or something like that, but with one more syllable, Eleganza, Fantasia, Porphyria, Cryptomania. Was an unnatural redhead with cleavage. She had no jewelry on and possibly no makeup either. She sat erect and smiled at her mother and did not look at him, as of course she wouldn't, as she was only 24 or something, born when Dominic was already cheating on women he'd been living with. I don't know if she's being really serious about this, he said to the room, or if it's just a titillating game, like the game of who would you sleep with, or which of my friends is the hottest that we used to play in our 20s before we all got scared off such games because they're evidently dangerous. It is a fun game, and we don't have to actually follow through on it. He was aware that he was speaking as if before a class, and that this tone and manner could be irritating to his friends, but he couldn't help himself. He enjoyed it. He did not glance at Christine's face. He didn't know how she was taking this and didn't want to know. The rules of this kind of relationship, he said evenly, are easy to figure out but less easy to implement. For example, we could have an agreement that we tell each other if we have some new partner in mind, fine, I think that's what we'd have to do. But the evening would come, the day of the date, and one of us, say my wife, would say, okay, I'm going out now with Raul. You haven't met him. He's 20 years old, because we've agreed that 19 is too young, have we not? And okay, he's 20 years old, and he's 6'3", and he doesn't speak English very well, and I'll be out all night, so don't wait up. So then the other partner, say me, stays up all night after having watched a lot of porn and trying very hard to get to sleep in various ways, and then is very sad and angry in the morning. I just don't see that working either way. Christine spoke now. She said, some of us are already used to that. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Yikes, that's hard to follow. This is an amazing book, and I want to start out by saying I read it from beginning to end. I read it from beginning to end very quickly, partly because I wanted to get away from these characters so badly. There's a part of me that thought, I can't stand these people.
Oops, okay, here I am. You can't stand Dominic and Christine?
No, in general, just speaking
No,
generally.
but Dominic and Christine, what do you think?
Dominic, Christine, so here's where I want to end up about that story, yes. So as I'm reading through, I'm thinking, well, okay, the other thing that's making me uncomfortable at this is because I see a reflection of myself and the ambiguities of moral character and the ambiguities of human character, so forth and so on. And what I loved was at the end of that story, somebody wrote recently, Jose Teodoro, in a review of this book in the Globe and Mail, says that, it's not just satire because it's a mixture of criticism and compassion. And I thought to myself, when you get to the end of that story, at the very end of this collection, there's this gorgeous moment where Dominic witnesses Catherine as if in a scene he's not supposed to see. She's sitting there knitting, she's in her terry cloth robe, she's got her bottle of Coke beside her, she's watching a television show that he would not approve of. And it's this gorgeous moment where he just leaves her on her own. So I want to start out by asking you a question about redemption. Is there a necessary, is the word redemption or redemptiveness any part of your vocabulary in terms of thinking about these characters?
Well, yeah, sure. And I very much don't dislike them. They're me and my friends. That story has a happy ending. One of the, there's two stories in it that with anything that could be remotely considered a happy ending. That and Raccoons, where there's a moment, there's a couple who hate each other, but there's a moment of united front that they have at the end. Yeah. So those are really the only moments where one might see a relationship succeeding. There's also one story, the story called Research, which is about two graduate students who are coming down from a long night of ecstasy, an ecstasy high. They've been dancing at a rave all night. And she's having an affair with this guy. She has to go back to her boyfriend who she lives with, and they're sad to part. But that's true love in that story. I felt that I really wanted them to be in love, and although the story ends up being about his career trajectory, I did feel that I was at least trying to portray genuine tenderness there. Most of the other couples are not happy, and they all have a secret of some kind, and it could be infidelity, but it could be secret drug use, and in the case of Christine, in Sleeping with an Elf, It's that she's a bit tired of going out, and so what happens in the story, I'm going to spoil it, but so so she encourages Dominic to go out with Conchetta Acolienza's daughter, who she calls Cenerentola. But,
That was a brilliant movie.
it's not really her name. And Dominic guiltily says, yeah, we're going to go to the cool new club. Frederick is inviting them to the cool new club. And Christine says, go. And Dominic is suspicious. Why would she send him away? And he's actually suspicious that she's already having an affair with someone. So she actually backtracks and goes back to their house and spies on her through the window of their living room. And what he sees shocks him more than anything he could have seen, which is, yeah, she's in her bathrobe. She's knitting, which is something he never would have imagined her to do, and it's for a friend's child. And she's got a bottle of Diet Coke, and she's watching a reality TV show. And he realizes he's seen her because she's a very glamorous woman, and he can't admit to her that he's seen it, and he backs away and leaves her to it, and goes back to the bars. But he feels a terrible protectiveness of her in that moment, as if she were his only child. And I have optimism for them, for that couple, not so much for the others.
Well, and let me be clear about that. Yes, there was that moment where I'm reading through and I'm thinking to myself, oy, oy. And of course, every step of the way, what's compelling is that it's sort of like a train wreck, but you can't look away. But it's not a train wreck because it's not disaster. It's who we are as individuals. So there's this step along the way where I'm thinking to myself, is this satire? Because satire is meant to make us create a kind of distance between us and the work. And implicitly, satire, as I understand it, makes us draw in some kind of moral judgment implicitly about it. We want some sort of order to step back in. That's not the case with these people. There's more grace going on in your writing, if I can put it that way.
Thank you. My early books were highly satirical. I mean, they were slapstick often. Portrayals of the big city in which everything was a bit exaggerated, everything slightly hysterical. And the point was largely humor and, yes, criticism. And these stories are a little bit more serious. However, there's satirical elements, and obviously the passage that I read, the description of the restaurant, that's pretty much like my old-fashioned style of satire. I'm satirizing the hipster restaurant and the trends that we're so familiar with. And I generate, for me, I'm amused by extremes of behavior. And so I take what I see as typical fashionable urban behavior, and I just exaggerate it just slightly. So I have been struck by how contemporary fashion in certain areas seems to be a creation of costumes, and so I just tweaked that a little bit. Yeah.
You have, this will sound like such a banal thing to say, you have this incredible capacity to mark the details of their everyday existence, and of course that's part of outlining characters and characterization. That's what any great author does. But you have a sense of a way of putting your reader viscerally into the space of how it's unfolding, so that they become sort of embodied characters in the middle, and yet at the same time they're oddly anonymous. They're not quite sure of where their lives go. Where does anonymity and not knowing who you are? There's a beautiful moment in the two. He says, "When are you going to get back into your real life?" The story about the woman writing her PhD thesis. When are you going to get back into your real life? And that startled me because, of course, as an academic, I'm asking myself all the time, when am I going to get back in my real life? So what's the level of anonymity? What's the idea of anonymity, and where does that come from? How are these people in their lives and not in their lives?
Well, that's interesting. A lot of the book is about exclusivity and privilege. And so I'm often trying to display the insides of underground or exclusive places. So, for example, the Techno Club. But also, the title story called Confidence is set in a members-only club that's a bar-restaurant complex, and closely resembles one that I belong to in Toronto, although it's not named. And the people there are behaving as if they're on a stage. And I find that public social spaces generally are like that. That's why I choose restaurants for so many of my settings. Even the restaurant I just described, you are on a stage because you are being observed by everybody else, and you can observe everybody else's performance. And in these kinds of spaces, particularly that hipster restaurant I described, that's the kind of place where the beau monde is going to go. So you're probably going to recognize people there. If you're in, a lot of these people work in the arts and media, and so they're gossips, and they're going to say, oh, that's the Art Foundation lady, that's the filmmaker. Same when in the private club in Confidence, everyone's looking around, and a lot of the dialogue is people arguing about who's who. They're saying, is that Charles Easton? Is his family the dog food family? You know, and who is this guy? There's one character in that story who is a young man. In a members club, you tend to know a lot of the members, but there's a young man who is sitting writing furiously in a notebook, and everybody's wondering who he is he a member, how did he get in there, what is he writing about, and he makes everybody nervous because he's not known. So people are projecting their roles all the time in those spaces, so they are trying to, they have no anonymity whatsoever, but at the same time they have secret lives, their cell phones buzzing guiltily in their pockets, their secret visits to the bathroom, or their secret yearnings for someone who's not there, who's dumped them or who's dead. So the reason I chose, I think, the title story for the title of the book is because there is a theme of people trying to project great confidence in the city, and obviously privately not feeling much confidence at all. In the case of the two PhD students, and that's the story called Research, they are out of real life in two ways, because one is they're coming down from this high, they've been in this otherworldly space of the black box club, dancing all night on ecstasy. They're coming down and they're trying to reintegrate themselves into the everyday world, and it's a stinking hot summer day, and they're dry, dehydrated, sleepless, and they try to go outside, and one of them says that everything's closed, and the other one says, well, why? And oh, because it's some kind of holiday. And the guy says, well, what holiday is it? And she says, it's Canada Day. They don't know what Canada Day is, because they live outside of 9 to 5 work, and so a holiday is meaningless to them, and so it's just an annoyance, really. So they are very much of an underground, that this does not belong to society, so they're outsiders in that way, but they're also high. But thirdly, she has this other life, this relationship with a man that she's avoiding. She has to go back to her apartment she shares with him, and that's really the real life that she's going to have to enter into. And when they go down to the lake, to Lake Ontario, set in Toronto, they go down to Lake Ontario, and I don't know how many here. You don't have to put up your hands if you have actually been on Lake Ontario high on early in the morning in a really, really hot day. It's a very, very uncomfortable. You're seeking nature. You want calm, right? And so you want a cool breeze. You want a park or something. And it provides exactly the opposite. There's no cool breeze ever comes off Lake Ontario in the summer. It's stinking. It smells of sewage. It's crowded with tourists, and it's just as bad as being in the. So they can't get what they want, and so they sit in the shade of a tree and they observe people and they judge their outfits. They judge them whether they're a do or a don't, because they'd been reading a lot of Vice magazine when Vice magazine used to do its do's and don'ts, and so they're very much outside too. They're like ghosts. They cannot participate in the scene.
Yeah. Lacan, literary critic talking here now, trying to sound really important. So the French psychoanalyst Lacan says that love is giving what you don't have to somebody who doesn't want it. And it seems to me that the way you track desire in this novel is like nothing I've ever read before, because it's always going to the place that it's supposed to go to a certain goal, but it never goes there. It's always going wayward. Can you talk a little more about how you're thinking about the desire of your characters?
Well, all the protagonists are men in this collection. In the previous collection, I tried a section called Young Women, where I had from 3 stories from a female point of view, and I have a whole novel called Muriel Pent, which is told from different points of view, but largely from that of a middle-aged woman. In this collection, the publisher really wanted a kind of a unified set of themes. And so we tried to select similar stories. And so they're all urban, and they are all told from a male perspective. And all of those males are tortured by desire. And I mean they really are not happy with their desire. They feel trapped by the desire because their desire is constantly distracting. They can't focus on anything. They're constantly aware of female bodies and body parts around them, and it's just pulling on them all the time, and it's pulling on the threads of their relationships all the time. So the yearning that I'm trying to describe is not entirely joyous. It's not euphoric. I don't know if you've seen Louis C.K., the comedian, does a very funny bit about this, about how a man can never explain to a woman the sense of constant pressure caused by desire, in the sense of its inescapability, that you cannot put it out of your head for 1 second, that you and I'm just being Louis C.K. here, I'm not being me, but he says, a woman could go up to a bank teller and have a transaction and think about the transaction or think about what she's going to do next and walk away. And we have to go up to the bank teller and say, okay, I'm doing a transaction. No, not fuck, no tits. As Louis C.K. said. And he says, oh yes, women say, I have desire. Sure, I feel horny all the time. He says, you have no idea. He says, it's like in the Vietnam War. You are Jane Fonda climbing up on the tank, and we are John McCain in the Viet Cong cell. That's his strange analogy. I'm trying to describe the constant desire that way.
So I've got this quote from, oddly enough, a man named Robert Rowland Smith, who's a critic at Cambridge. Construing happiness in terms of its pursuit is to introduce an essential anxiety. Happiness becomes an object of desire, and the trouble with desire is that it's importunate and unresting. Take the holy truths of Buddhist scripture. The first declares that there is suffering in the world, a proposition with which it's hard to argue. Then the second comes in with the cause of all suffering is wanting. Well, the pursuit of happiness is a form of wanting, just like anything else. So the problem with wanting happiness is as much the wanting as the happiness. Deep inside us, wanting creates a hole, a lack, a gap. Wanting happiness equals wanting for happiness and feeling empty. I love the fact that you're not worried about happiness in these stories particularly.
Well, I think all these people are trying to seek happiness in some way. They're troubled by desire. They're also troubled by constant anxiety because of the hiding of the secrets, but also because of life in the city. I mean, what I love, and I try to get humor out of this in all my books, is trying to describe the incredible stress of getting from A to B in the city, and particularly Toronto, which has a very poor public transit and very bad traffic at the moment, and everybody's always late and anxious about that, and that's overlaid over their desire, and that's why I like to describe as many. The details you were describing, the physical details surrounding the characters, are usually obstacles of some kind. I'm in love with obstacles, even if I have to get a character just across the room, like Dominic with his cane, or not wanting to be seen walking past a certain table, or past Frederick, or we're going to have this talk, but oh my God, here's Frederick. We can't have the talk. In the story Raccoons, there's a couple. And they are constantly being interrupted by a 3-year-old boy. And the 3-year-old boy is very garrulous, as 3-year-olds who've just discovered language are. And a lot of his speech is random words. And I had a 3-year-old boy when I wrote it. So I quoted verbatim what he was saying. And whenever he had a new word, he would just say it. He didn't know what it meant. So, he would say, Daddy, what is ingredients? What is fascinating? Daddy, let's pretend we're Hondas. Let's pretend we're Mounties on a racetrack. And he said once to his mother, he woke her up early in the morning and he said, Mommy, let's pretend we're in Chicago. He didn't know what Chicago was. And she and I had a fight over who was going to get to use that line, because she's a writer as well. And I beat her to it. And I put that line in, and she's not pleased.
Plagiarist.
Yeah.
The fact that story you draw on Rob Ford and crack.
Right.
cocaine,
There's
that
well, there's an
particular story.
incident. Rob Ford is not a character in the story, but the parents are arguing, and the little boy is just picking up on things around him, and he's been listening to the news, and they haven't realized he's been listening to the news, and he interrupts an argument by saying, "Daddy, what is crack cocaine?" And that happened to me. Same thing, just out of the blue. What is crack cocaine? And the daddy gets down on his knees and he says, "Well, it's a poison. It's a poison. It's something very bad for you, and you should never touch it, or you will have to go to the hospital." And the boy says, and this is exactly our conversation as it happened. And the boy says, "And you smoke it?" And I said, "No, you don't. You don't smoke it." And he said, "But the mayor smokes it." I said, "Well, yeah. Well, yes." But he says he doesn't smoke it. And I said, "Well," and so then I have the wife in the story is angry at her husband and suspects that he's keeping a secret. She intervenes and she says, "Yes, sweetie, sometimes grown-up men lie." And that's her little barb at her husband. So that's all the mention of Rob Ford. I mean, his name doesn't come up. It's just there's a mayor in the news who's smoking crack cocaine. But I wanted to use it.
But we know
as
it's Rob Ford.
it was just an example of, again, the tensions of the city, the stresses of the city, and I wanted that story. That story is full of menace. There's all kinds of things that are about to go wrong. The house is under threat from two forces. One is there's raccoons that seem to have crawled into the walls, which is something that happened to me, and they got under my floorboards. And it was very expensive to get them out. And it's at night, the rustling was so close and loud, it was very troubling. At the same time, this guy is under attack from an ex-girlfriend who's threatening to reveal the fact that they had an affair if he doesn't return to her some videotapes they made, some sex tapes they made together. And she's threatening to come and firebomb his house, and I'm going to tell your wife. So he's getting these threatening phone calls. The house is under attack from raccoons. And at the same time, the news is full of this toxic news that he doesn't want his son to hear. So his son is very much under threat. And there's a scene that I really wanted to make the reader nervous in that story, where he lies to his wife. He says, "We're going to go drop some old things at the Salvation Army. I'm taking the boy." So he puts him in the car, and he drives to the house of this woman, his ex, of the affair, his mistress, to give her these videotapes so that she can destroy them. And he can't find a place to park right in front of her door, so he has to park with the car just out of sight, and he walks away. He leaves the boy in the car, and he walks away just a few meters, but he just can't quite see the boy. He doesn't want to bring the boy in to see the lady in the apartment. You've all had that moment as a parent of, how far away from the car can I walk and for how long? And he knows he's really pushing it there. And I really wanted the reader to be nervous that something bad was going to happen to the boy. Nothing does. Nothing does. But I just wanted to really stress the danger of going to that woman's house and how everything was a danger there.
That was a beautifully realized passage, and yes, I was crapping my drawers reading the whole thing. I thought the visualization of this as a film would be incredible.
Yeah, and he's standing, he won't go into the house. He stands at the doorway and keeps peering at his car to see if he can still see his son in the car.
It asks the question, how much responsibility does one take for another life? Your kid's life, first of all, would you have ultimate response? And yet you're thinking of your own desire at the same time, and you have to satisfy both things
he's trying to
simultaneously.
protect his household, too. I mean, he's trying to protect the whole family thing. So, yeah.
I'm not supposed to ask this question because this really is banal, but I really am fascinated to know, where does your first inspiration come from these stories? Is it just observation of every day? I mean, I'm thinking about the Rob Ford incident, so I'm thinking you're listening to the radio, or you're hearing this stuff, your interactions with your son, so forth and so on.
I think it's anecdote. It's funny stories my friends have told me, or something so every story, the kernel of it is an anecdote that is probably true. Like I did for years have that conversation with my wife about an open relationship. So that really came out of real life. But then everything else is invented after that. I often start with place too, just the sense, before I can start writing a scene, I have to know very clearly where it's happening. Is it a room? Is it a taxi? And what the light looks like and what it smells like. I actually have to know if there's smell of perfume or cigarettes or what, because that will inform what happens in it. But just in answer to your question, where the stories come from, yeah, I mean, an anecdote, usually something slight and amusing, like the fact that I had raccoons in my house. It was the origin. And I felt it was very stressful. And I paid one company to get them out, and they came back, and it was a nightmare. But so I wanted to do a story of urban nightmare, so I used that, but then I added other nightmarish levels, the angry ex-girlfriend, the kid in danger, all that to just up it. Everything that happens to us in our day is a potential story, but it's not a story. Because stories have an arc. They have a beginning, a middle, and end. And a short story has to end with some sense of change. Right? That's my only definition of a story. That something has changed between the beginning of the story and the end. Either for the character, or it could be for the reader. The reader could have come to some realization, see something in a different light. And that's why we have the tradition. I mean, the traditional modernist short story is the epiphanic story. It ends with a moment of realization. And most of mine loosely hew to that. There's some moment of realization at the end. Well, we don't have those in our day. Our day is multiple overlaid threads, overlaid narratives and distractions. At any given moment, you're thinking about a dozen things simultaneously, and you're listening to the radio, and you're driving. And some experimental authors do try to duplicate that stream of consciousness writing. Joyce tried to duplicate those multiple streams. It's very difficult to do. I don't do that. I try to follow one narrative, which is already artificial. That's already stylizing what's happening. You're choosing very carefully what to include and what to exclude. But you also have to start making up stuff that didn't really happen in order to give it a significance. Because, like I said, the day doesn't have a beginning, middle, and end. It has no significance. Your day just melds in with the next day, and your story of what's going on with your mother continues. And so it's highly artificial to come up with these stories and then give them moments of ending, of significance. And that's why we have art, because our days don't have any significance. I mean, that's what because we want to somehow try to make sense of it.
Beautifully put. And yet, you do this glorious job of introducing the completely arbitrary into that narrative, which is a real moment. Art doesn't introduce that, but art can articulate that for us in a certain kind of way.
What do you mean the arbitrary? Like
the arbitrary, the contingent. Something happens that you didn't expect to happen, and
right.
it suddenly changes things completely.
Yeah.
How much has, in terms of going from where you were in your earlier writing to now, how much has aging, getting older,
well,
affected
the
your
characters
vision?
are obviously older, so yeah. I mean, I started out writing about really young people, and now I'm writing about middle-aged people. Just where my interest lies, I guess. And yeah, I'm interested in aging and their declining sexual attractiveness. I mean, in that story, Sleeping with an Elf, Dominic and Christine realize with some sadness that all of the young people who work there are going to get laid that night, and Dominic and Christine aren't. They have to sit and make these careful plans, and they long for that, and they say, "Oh my God! Now that we're over 40, we come to restaurants," and they both admit, "Oh, we're eating more. We didn't used to eat very much at all. We would go out and drink, and the eating was just a kind of fuel for that. And now we have more money, and we go out to restaurants, and it's a kind of destination. And how sad that is that we care so much about food. These guys, the elf and his friends, they don't care about food. They're going to scarf down some fries. And so now we're over 40. We just go to these restaurants to eat their food and look at them. and she says we're kind of sex ghouls in that way.
I love that phrase. I have a final question, which is not on the topic of this book, but since you wrote a recent Globe and Mail piece about the fact that there's erotic fan fiction being written about our current prime minister. I wouldn't know, I have not checked this out. How important is it, this is a serious question, how important is it that we have a political leader now ahead of our country who is somebody that we would actually imagine sleeping with, as opposed to the previous prime minister? And I do imagine sleeping with our current prime minister.
Yes, well, speak for yourself.
And I am.
So what's the question? What does it say that we want?
The seriousness of the question, if it's serious at all, is, I think it's important that we have a sort of symbolic value in a leader who demonstrates a kind of vitality. And I just wanted to know if
well,
you
there
wanted
has
to
been
comment on
sexual fan fiction about Obama for quite some time, because he's a sexy figure as well. But believe it or not, Google any world leader and you can find sexual fantasy. I mean, Angela Merkel, no problem. You're going to find fan fiction about Angela Merkel and Obama getting it on, or Putin, or Putin and Obama getting it on, or yeah. And I argued in my column that this is not just sexual fantasy, but it's also a form of subtle undermining of the authority and power of these great figures to give them human and gross characteristics. It's obviously excited the whole rest of the world to the degree I never would have imagined that we have a good-looking prime minister. It's hit all the
and a good-looking partner.
And a good-looking partner, and it's hit all the global media. And the last time it happened was in 1968 with his father.
It wasn't Diefenbaker? Thank you. All right, enough of us. Questions from the audience?
I just wanted to ask, you mentioned that your partner was a writer, and I thought, do you see this as a real bonus, or is it more difficult, or it doesn't come into play?
It's a huge drag. It has been actually a really serious problem between us for a number of reasons. So, what was the question? My partner is also a writer. Is that advantageous to my writing? No. For one thing, there's a practical problem that we both work at home in a very small house, and it's no fun. I need absolute solitude, and I talk to myself, and I pace around, and I don't want anyone else asking me what the plans for the weekend are. And we have had an immense number of fights about that. So there's that. But there's also the sense that we're both struggling, striving. Nobody has a stable job, nobody has a steady income, and we both suffer then from the insecurities of the job, which makes a lot of stress. And there isn't competition so far. She published a nonfiction book, but she's coming out with a novel next year, and then we'll see how happy I am.
Stay tuned.
I would, a lot of writers have said that it is very important for a writer to have a partner with a steady job. I would highly recommend that over. Yeah.
Other questions?
Hey, Russell. Just a question about your oeuvre. You have a remarkable variety of different forms that you write in: short stories, novels, autobiography, erotica, I believe, and plus you've got a huge number of critical essays that you've written for the Globe and Mail. I'm just wondering if there's one particular form that you feel most comfortable with or that you enjoy the most? Yeah.
Well, it's definitely fiction. All the other things I do just to make a living. If I could stop writing magazine and newspaper articles tomorrow, I would. There's a very different part of the brain that's used to write those. It's different muscles. A nonfiction article or essay is an exercise in explanation. It must be clear and linear. And fiction is almost the opposite. It's almost an exercise in hiding as much as presenting. So when you're writing nonfiction, you want to be explicit. When you're writing fiction, you want to be implicit. And it's the old mantra that you've heard in a million creative writing classes, you want to show, not tell, whereas nonfiction is all telling. So when I imagine a scene in fiction, I have to see it as if on a screen and describe what I'm seeing, and I want to try to avoid as much as possible explaining why everyone's doing what they're doing, and I use tricks to avoid telling. For example, instead of saying, so-and-so felt very anxious and wanted to leave, I'll give him a line of dialogue and then say, so-and-so looked at his watch. It's just a simple trick to use action instead of explanation. Well, that's a whole different thing from writing nonfiction, and it's more difficult. And I need to be in a much more focused state, almost like a trance, it's kind of dreaming. And there are many parallels between fiction and dream. One of them is that in dream, things tend to be heightened, right? They tend to be amplified. The colors can be the most vivid you've ever seen, and the sensation suddenly of grief can be extraordinarily amplified. And in fiction, that happens too, because we can't see the characters, we're creating them in our own brains. So a similar process of imagination is going on. It's a much more active creation than that of really experiencing almost any other art form. So it's a very weird state to get yourself into, and I have to have quiet, and I can't be arguing with someone, I can't be too emotional. Whereas if a nonfiction piece, if I'm writing an explanation of an issue in the publishing industry, and I pick up the phone and I have a fight with someone, I can hang up the phone and I can get back to it. But with fiction, it'll throw me off, and I can't. So I do enjoy the fiction most. Now, within fiction, I think that I'm enjoying short stories a lot right now. It may just be because this book has had such a great success. I think, oh, good, I'm good at short stories, so I should keep doing that. But there's a moment of excitement about Canadian short stories, isn't there? I mean, we had Alice Munro win the Nobel Prize. We had Lynn Cody win the Gillmor. We've had a number, even on this year's Gillmor shortlist, there's a couple of books of short stories. This drives the booksellers crazy because people don't buy books of short stories. They're not interested, and it's bad for business. But there's a sudden moment of critical interest in this. I'm not really sure why it's happening. So maybe that's exciting me the most.
And I neglected to mention that, of course, as you all know, this book was longlisted for the Gillmor Prize and also a finalist for the Writers' Trust Prize. Other questions?
Hi, Russell. I wanted to ask you about your decision to set these stories in Toronto. You don't have to look very hard to find cases of very famous authors historically going on record, explaining their hesitancy to set their fiction in Toronto. And one commonly repeated thing that you hear is this it's partly because Toronto kind of exists in the shadow of cities like Montreal and New York that have a much richer cultural heritage and so forth. And I was just wondering, if your decision to set these stories and some of your other work in Toronto is just because you're drawing from your own life, which, I mean, you live in Toronto, or if you're responding also to this hesitancy in general to...
Yeah, it's a good question, and the answer is both. I started off, my first book was set in Toronto, and at that point there was very much a defiance, yes, to name it explicitly and to try to represent it as a big city. Because as you said, it's not considered a big city by people in the United States or in Europe. It was a big city to me because I'd just come from Halifax. I'd grown up in Halifax, and I'd spent some years in Kingston and in other small university towns. And for me, I knew I was Canadian, and I was writing Canadian literature because I can do nothing else, because that's all I know. But I wanted to make sure that I was sort of defiantly saying, well, the urban experience is a very important part of Canada, so let's let's be honest about it and say that a typical Canadian lives in a city. And statistically, that is true. There are more Canadians live in cities than outside them. And so, yes, there was definitely an ideological point to describing Toronto explicitly. And I wanted to mythologize it and make people see that it was a pretty cool city. And I think it is, because it's a big enough city to have all the luxuries and undergrounds that big cities have. There are absurdly expensive restaurants, there are private clubs, you know, there's underground electronic music, there's dominatrixes, right? There's, you can hail a cab on the street, which you cannot in Calgary, or Halifax. There are lots of places where you can stay out all night. All those things made it a city, and yet, unlike the great cities of the world, it was, certainly at that time, affordable for an artist to live downtown. Less and less so, but at that time, it was at that fantastic Goldilocks moment where, yeah, you could have access to all the crowds and intensity of a city, and you could have an apartment on Queen Street West, which you could not do even in the 1990s in Greenwich Village, and certainly not in Paris or London. Berlin, yes, but I thought it was amazing. It became a very artistic city for that reason, because there was a mix of social classes. And then, as the years went on, I started getting nervous about naming specific places in Toronto in the fiction, and here's why. Because I realized that my audience was growing international, and I didn't want to have to use a shorthand that they would have to know Toronto to understand. So, for example, in my novel Girl Crazy, I said, Justin and Jenna go for a drink in a bar on College Street. And my editor stopped me, and she said, "You sure you want to do that?" She said, "You know, there are going to be readers in Red Deer and in Hamburg that don't know what College Street is. It's just a street name for them. Are you sure you're not being lazy? You're just not just using a kind of shorthand instead of describing the street, because you assume that people know what College Street looks like, that it's a busy street, entertainment street." So I changed it, and I put something like they agreed to meet in a street full of cafes near the university. And so I'm actually using place names less and less. And in Confidence, the word Toronto is never mentioned. It's never explicitly named as Toronto, even though it's obviously Toronto if you know it. Partly, I mean, there is a certain amount of cynicism there too, that that one does want to sell in a U.S. market, and the word Toronto all over something is not going to make it popular there. But it's not hidden though. But you just don't want to broadcast it. You want to call it a big city.
No other questions? Yes.
The library here in London once had a human book thing where the people were the open book. I don't remember exactly what it was called. And I find this is an amazing thing where you get to meet an artist. And then, I don't know, maybe you could take that from there. I don't know what I'm going to, but I enjoyed that event. This is similar to that. Any comment on that?
It's like an AMA. Ask me anything, but don't. I don't want to be that open. Someone asked me, I did a panel discussion in Kitchener just this afternoon, just before coming here in Waterloo. And someone was talking about the idea of self-exposure, that whenever you write fiction, do you feel naked on a stage? And yeah, I do. But I feel more naked writing the fiction than I do answering these questions. I mean, this is easier to control my answers. But when I'm writing fiction, I'm not thinking about a reader. I'm not thinking about their response. I'm just imagining a scene. And then you don't realize until it's too late, oh, my mother's going to read this. And that's a very naked moment.
What does your mother think?
Well, I did publish a pornographic novel several years ago, under a pseudonym at first, and I wanted it to be published by a mass market pornography producer. And it was eventually published by a small press in Toronto, and I told my mother, just don't read it, please. Just don't read it. My mother is a retired school teacher and librarian and does a lot of copy editing and indexing. So I couldn't stop her. Her only response was to get back to me with some errors, just some copy edits.
I want to know what names you misspelled. It was a pleasure for me to read this collection. It's a pleasure for me to read your writing. You have an amazing honesty. That's another banal thing to say, but you're fearless, as I started out by saying, in terms of how you just observe life. And it's wonderful for all of us to have that reflected back to us, those of us who spend sometimes trying to contain ourselves and not see what is right in front of us, including ourselves. Thank you for that.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.